Hello, and welcome to Very Kimberly, the healed side of codependency. God did indeed provide a way for me to escape. And I can honestly say that it was only through the sheer grace and strength of God and God alone that I was able to follow through. So, I just want to say before I get into this next chapter of my testimony that my escape from Joe was nothing short of a complete miracle. It was in no way, shape, or form the result of my own personal wisdom, resilience, or strength. It wasn't even the result of my faith because it was at this point that my soul was also starting to have some very, very deep spiritual questions and doubts. See, when you finally leave a narcissist whom you have had children with, you may have escaped direct abuse, but the indirect abuse will always remain until the children are grown. And I was struggling tremendously during this time to understand why God wasn't just swooping in and removing Joe from our lives altogether. I was struggling to understand why my quote great escape end quote still made me feel trapped in many ways because I was still in constant survival mode. Being married to a religious narcissist for 7 years also solidified my codependent mindset and pulled me deeper into codependent relationship patterns. Then there was the issue of dysfunction already being laid as the foundation within my own family, immediate and extended. These mindset patterns did not happen overnight, nor did they simply manifest in my past abusive relationships or marriage. See, a person's identity or who they think that they are is often, if not always, tied to family background. In other words, who your family says that you are. God had to allow me to experience and see who and what my entire family really was so that I could start seeing myself as different and set apart and start identifying myself with him instead of them. And I could not see the worth and value God had placed within me through Christ until I stopped placing this perceived power over my worth in their opinions or the roles they wanted me to play. The minivan was packed with as much as I could carry, but there were still many things I had to leave behind. Joe had hidden away all of our birth certificates and social security cards, and there was no time to pack up any sentimental items like baby pictures of the girls, old family photos, or dolls I had as a child. I had left a note for Joe explaining why I was leaving and where I was going so that he could not say that I was kidnapping the kids. I wrote that I did not want a divorce, but I wanted him to get professional and spiritual help for his addictions. I had made up in my mind that if Joe's addictions were at the root of his abusiveness, then maybe, just maybe, if he got help, our marriage and our family could be saved. But I'll be honest, the abuse had gotten so bad, and I had seen such unrepentant evil from Joe that I really didn't have much hope for that outcome. My boss, Jenny, had given me not only my last paycheck, but also all the paid time off that I had accumulated. We stopped by the speech clinic, and the ladies there gave gifts to the girls and collected money for me. I was very sad to have to leave. I loved my job. I loved the people I worked with. I loved the people of that community and church. And I even loved Joe's family. But I knew deep in my heart that Joe's family and church would take his side, believing any lie that was told about me and why I left. And that broke my heart. My leaving would never be justified in their eyes, because they either could not see or refused to see Joe for who he really was and what he had become. And no one but me knew about Joe's addictions. Not that they would have believed it anyway. But what fueled my decisions in that circumstance once I arrived back home at my grandmother's house in Pennsylvania was that underlying fear of Joe killing us all and possibly himself. He had already threatened to do so the first time I had attempted to run away. Jurisdiction for custody of the girls would also stay in North Carolina for 6 months. And at any point, Joe could have the state police force me to move back to North Carolina for a custody hearing. So for 6 months, I had to figure out a way to pacify Joe's rage, while at least limiting his time with Susie and Kristen. I also did not want to traumatize the girls any more than they were already being traumatized by the entire situation. Susie was only 5 years old, Kristen only 4, and Mavis 6 years old. And they were much too young to understand why I had left. At first, after we arrived in Pennsylvania, Joe did agree to get professional help, but only after 2 AA meetings, he started attempting to gaslight me by saying he didn't have a problem, that I was the one with a problem. I was the one who was just crazy for holding him accountable. When he threatened to have the police force me back to North Carolina, I threatened to file a PFA on account of the rape. I told him that if he made me move back to North Carolina, that I would move us right into a domestic violence shelter, file the PFA, and he would never see his kids again. But I also conceded to giving up every major holiday with Susie and Kristen, and every summer vacation. I gave up making Christmas cookies with them and seeing them open presents on Christmas morning. I gave up dressing them in pretty Easter dresses and dyeing Easter eggs. And I gave up taking them on fun summer activities like swimming in amusement parks and just simply enjoying spending time with them. I had to give up a very large part of being a mom to Susie and Kristen, because the weight of providing for our needs and keeping us safe was now solely mine to carry alone. Maybe it always was. Some might ask, well, why didn't you just file the PFA anyway? And that is a question I've often asked myself and struggle with to this very day. But what most people don't realize is that marital rape is extremely difficult to prove. Narcissistic abuse is not considered a crime by law, and a PFA is very often just a piece of paper. And that piece of paper would not have stopped Joe from retaliating with violence and death. Joe's parents had already offered to financially help Joe fight me in court in the past. I, by myself, did not have the financial means to take on that fight. And no one in my family was offering to support me in that way either. So I did what I had to do and made the decisions I had to make with the least amount of damage possible under the circumstances. My grandmother's house was only about 20 minutes away from Aunt Dottie and Uncle Chris, Amber and Matt, and Holly and Sam. Uncle David and his wife Valerie also lived around the same area. And Dad still lived about an hour away on the other side of Pittsburgh. However, the amount of support that I had anticipated and needed from my family during this very vulnerable time was not exactly what I received. Aunt Dottie, Amber, and Holly were constantly in a state of dysfunctional conflict within themselves. And they would throw me right in the middle of it, helping, but then immediately refusing to help whenever I was still talking to another member of that family that they were in conflict with. See, their support wasn't so much about me and the kids, but about whose side I was on. The problem was I wasn't on anyone's side, nor did I have any desire to participate in their drama. I was just trying to survive, take care of the girls, and take care of my grandmother's house and estate. In the beginning, Uncle David and Aunt Valerie were the ones who helped me the most, with Uncle David fixing my grandfather's tractor and teaching me how to use it to mow the 3 acres of land on my grandmother's property. Aunt Valerie would call me regularly to check on me and the kids, but they both also seemed to be more concerned about Mavis. See, their daughter, my cousin Barb, had health issues which prevented her from having children of her own. So, back at the funeral when Mom passed away, I had initially asked Barb if she wanted to adopt Mavis. But Barb had just gotten married to her college sweetheart Paul. And Paul had said, quote, "No, it was too soon." Barb and Paul lived in Virginia, where Barb worked as an engineer and Paul worked as a computer technician. They were definitely in a good position financially to take care of Mavis now. So, in hindsight, what I believe was the driving force behind Uncle David and Aunt Valerie's support during this time was their desire to have a grandchild and for Barb to have a child of her own. Mavis was now older, much easier to take care of than she was at just 2 years old when Mom passed away. This meant that any help that I received from them was laced with selfish intentions and a hidden agenda. What I perceived as empathy for me as a struggling single mom was, in reality, a potential opportunity for them and their daughter. My dad would also drive up to help me paint rooms in the house, but often asked me about Diana's a portion of the estate. Of course, the estate lawyer was still taking his sweet time, much to my frustration as well. Diana had gone from one group home to another, her behaviors always leading them to kicking her out. Then Diana was assigned a caseworker by the county who established Section 8 housing for her. However, the areas that they would place her in were always ridden with drugs and crime. And I was starting to suspect Diana was on drugs as well, but no one in that family wanted to believe it. Dad refused to go to court to take guardianship of Diana, claiming she was incompetent, which she was. Diana had the mentality of a 12-year-old and was on disability, but she was also being forced by the system and, to a degree, my dad, to be an independent adult. Dad also could not understand why I was struggling so much financially, even though I was supporting myself and 3 young children completely alone. And instead of offering financial help, he criticized me for it. Dad possessed very little empathy for my situation, not just because he was a little slow or couldn't comprehend what I was going through, but also because my situation interfered with the role that I had been assigned in that family. See, my parents often told me during my childhood that someday I would have to take care of them and Diana. And it didn't matter that it was humanly impossible for me to fulfill that role all by myself, not to mention with 3 little girls. I was the normal one, the smart one after all, right? And it was an unspoken expectation that I would fill Grandma Helen's shoes as the family matriarch someday, taking care of everyone else. So any help that I received from my dad was to manipulate me into staying the course of preparing for that future role. The girls were also starting to act out repeatedly. All of a sudden, I was the authority figure in their lives, where they had been trained by Joe to only obey him. This was not only an adjustment for the girls, but for me as well. I was now free to make decisions by myself and for myself and the kids. But at the same time, I was also terrified of making those decisions. Even without the constant abusive control of Joe, I wasn't me anymore. That independently confident person deep inside was now completely gone, shattered into a million pieces. So I doubted myself constantly. Aunt Dottie would also often criticize me, saying that I was coddling the girls by giving them too much affection and not enough discipline. But they were just as traumatized as I was, now being forced to live in an unfamiliar environment, far away from the home and family that they knew and loved. I empathized with that more than they will ever realize. So I wanted to give them that empathy, comfort, and love that I never received in the past and still wasn't receiving from my own family. Susie seemed to be affected the most. She had terrible separation anxiety, even in preschool, but now it was worse. I also had started to suspect she might have ADHD. She was very kind, sweet, smart, and bright. But Susie could also be very impulsive and reckless. Susie was fearless about things she should have been afraid of, like climbing out her bedroom window onto the covered porch, but also terrified of things that didn't really exist. Things no one else saw, like monsters in the bathroom. Kristen, on the other hand, was my mini-me. She was tough, smart, naturally independent, and in some ways seemed more mature than Susie. Kristen learned things very quickly by observing the older two girls, and was able to pull from her environment any and all necessary things to accomplish any task she wanted to do. Mavis was the grounded one, the one who seemed like an old soul, mature and wise beyond her years, the natural-born leader. Yet Mavis still struggled with schoolwork. Mavis had a natural gift for drawing and art that I had picked up on when we first took her in, and I encouraged her to nurture it. Each one of my girls was unique and special in her own way, but that uniqueness often led to bickering between them, with lots and lots of little girl drama. So, single motherhood had become much more difficult than I originally thought it would be. The economy in the rural county where we lived was a lot worse than in North Carolina. So I had to concede to making significantly less money as a legal assistant in a small town law firm. Joe kept stalling the child support case, and my caseworker at the courthouse suggested that I settle for the much lesser amount than he was offering. I eventually caved on that one because, as my caseworker put it, something was better than nothing. I started taking the girls to a local Presbyterian church for a while, but I was still dealing with a lot of shame being a separated single mom, constantly worrying about how the people in that church saw me, and struggling to manage the girls acting out due to their own trauma just seemed to magnify that shame because I felt like a failure as a mother. My family's lack of real empathy only confirmed that in my mind. So it was that hidden, unmerited shame that caused me to slowly withdraw from taking them to church altogether. I was doing the best that I could, but no matter how hard I tried, it never felt like it was ever enough to make things better or easier for us. And instead of taking that feeling of shame to God and laying it down at the cross, I started to doubt God's love for me. I secretly started to believe that maybe my shame was holding back God's love. Maybe I had failed as a Christian too. And maybe that was why things were still so hard and difficult. But do you want to know something amazing? As extremely hard as that season in my life was, God still moved in my life in some pretty miraculous ways. I remember one day I had run out of laundry soap. I didn't have enough money to go out and buy some. And if I didn't do laundry, we wouldn't have clean clothes for the week. So, under my breath, I prayed, God, how am I going to do laundry without detergent and no money to buy some? Within 5 minutes, there was a knock on my door. My next door neighbor said that she had found some extra laundry detergent and thought I might need it. Everyone in that community was very kind and compassionate towards me and the girls. So when Christmas came around, I again prayed, God, how am I going to buy presents for the girls? The school staff signed them up for the community Secret Santa, and I was able to buy some more odds and ends at the local dollar store. We didn't have a lot, but we had what we needed, and God provided a way through it all. But do you want to know what got me through that difficult season in life the most? Listening to the girls laugh. When they would play together and just start giggling and laughing, it was the most precious sound I had ever heard in my entire life. No matter how much pain and turmoil we were going through, no matter how deep my hidden depression became, their little girl laughter became my joy. And it wasn't just the sound of them being happy, it was the sound of hope. I hope that you'll join me next time. And until then, this is Very Kimberly encouraging you to keep striving to be on the healed side of codependency.